Hi everybody, welcome to Bello's Designs. My name's Catherine and today I'm going to show you how to make something like this out of something that started out like that. Let's talk about the supplies we'll need for today's projects. From the latest Lavinia stamp release, we'll be using Luka LAV881. We'll also be using the River Root Corner, which is the small one, LAV884. The Moss Cap Cluster, LAV883. And from the previous release, we'll be using Dana, LAV863. The Thimbleweed, LAV872. And the Druid's Pass, LAV870. For inks, we'll be using the newer Versafine Clair Grass Green, Twilight, Nocturn, Sand Dune, and Portabello. From the Lavinia Elements collection, we'll be using Sundance, Olive, Confetti, and Dark Denim. I have a blending brush for each of the Elements inks, so I'll be using 4 of those. I also have a variety of Posca pens. I have the light green, the white, the orange, and the yellow. From my Sweet Poppy watercolor brush pen set, I'll be using the gray and the poppy, as well as one of the watercolor brushes. And then I've also like to keep on hand my Micron pen in case I need to touch up anything that doesn't stamp perfectly. I will also be using some black acrylic paint from my stash and the Lavinia Vanilla Custard chalk paint. We'll touch up our project at the very end with a couple of stickles. So I have the crystal and the lavender that I'll be using tonight. And I also have a corner rounder, so any corner rounder punch will do. And if you don't want to round your corners, you don't have to. I also have 2 pieces of multifarious cardstock that I have cut down to 2 3/8 by 2 3/8. Let's go ahead and get started. So for the first project tonight, we'll be using the Druid's Pass Dana and the small stamp from the Thimbleweed collection. I'm going to begin by rounding my corners using my punch. I just like the finished look of this, but if you don't have a corner rounder, you certainly don't need that. So we'll ink up the Druid's Pass in Nocturn by Versafine Clair. I'm really just going to focus on the middle of the stamp because it's such a small piece that we're just going to be using the top of that bridge. Once we have the Druid's Pass stamped, we're going to color it in with the Sweet Poppy watercolor brush, and I'm using the gray. And I do also have the blending pen on hand, but I'm not sure that I'm going to need it for this particular project because the gray is fairly light. But I'm just going to put it aside in case we do need it. Okay, there we have that. The next step is going to be to blend the background. For the background on this particular piece, I'm going to be using the elements in Sundance as well as the dark denim. So I'm going to start with the yellow Sundance just to make a little bit of glow around the top of the bridge, which will be coming from Dana's lantern. The next thing I'm going to add is Dana right to the top of the bridge with her little lantern, and we're going to stamp her in the Twilight Versafine Clair. Ink that up really well. So we have a little smudge there. All right, and I'm going to try to center her to the glow so I see that it's not quite in the middle. So we're going to move her just off to the left a little bit. And I'm going to really press that down and hold it there to give the ink a chance to soak into the cardstock. And that looks pretty perfect. The last bit of stamping that I'm going to use is the smaller Thimbleweed from the Thimbleweed set. And I'm going to stamp that in a combination of the Versafine Clair Grass Green and the Nocturn, starting with the green. And I'll do this in a few first and second generation stamps. few on the top, and we'll do a few on the bottom. Maybe a couple more at the very tip top. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. Clean this green off of my stamp and come back with the Nocturn. And once again, I'm going to be using first and second generation stamping here. And then a few on the bottom. There we go, I'm pretty happy with that. Now I just want to come back in once again with the dark denim and my blending brush just to darken up around the outside. Final step is to add a little bit of detail with the Posca pens and the stickles. So I'm going to clean this up over here. I'm going to be using a combination of the Posca pens in orange, yellow, green, and white, and then also the crystal stickles to add some detail. I'm going to start by adding a little bit of a yellow glow around Dana's lantern. Just like so. And a little dab of orange in the middle for the candlelight. There we go. Lastly, we're going to add some orbs around Dana. I'm going to do a combination of yellow, green, and white. So I'm going to start with the yellow, and we'll just add a few. I'm going to go from the yellow to the green next. And then finally, I will add some white. I'm going to add a couple to the bridge. Before I come in with the stickles, I'm going to use one of my chalk pastel pencils just to add a little bit of highlight to Dana. So you want to add that to your supply list, and I'm going to use the white for this. to her arm. I do like to use the chalk pastel pencils for this, especially when I'm working with a very small image like this, because it's easy to brush off any extra if you make a mistake. So, like I said, finally I'm going to come in with the crystal stickles, and it does look like my Posca pen paint is dry. So we're just going to add a little bit to her wings and then top off the orbs and set that aside to dry. There we go. That piece is ready to dry. Moving on to our second tiny picture, I'm going to begin once again by rounding off my corners using my corner rounder. And the first thing I'm going to stamp is the River Roots, and I'll be using the Portabello from Versafine Clair to get just into that corner right there. When I'm using the corner stamps, I like to get just slightly off of the edge so that my image comes all the way to the edge. And there we go. Daisy has a squeaky toy. She's fitting in nicely to our little clan over here. Okay. The next thing I'm going to stamp is Luka, and I'm going to do that in Nocturn. So once again, just making sure I ink him up really well. Looks like he's maybe got a little dimple there, but no worries. And I'm going to stamp him towards the edge because I want lots of room for my mushrooms. Give him a good press and a chance to really soak into that cardstock. And there we go. All right, and the last bit of stamping that I'm going to do tonight is the moss cap cluster, and I'm stamping that in the Sand Dune from Versafine Clair. I'll really only be using the very top of these mushrooms, so I don't need to ink up the whole stamp. We'll just be using just this portion because it's such a tiny little project. I like how that, I think I'm going to be pretty happy with that placement. And there we go. All right, that's the extent of our stamping on this piece. Now it's time to do a little bit of ink blending, but the Versafine Clair is oil-based, and I want to make sure that it's really dry so it doesn't smudge when I start blending on top of it. So I'm just going to use my paper to blot it a little bit. Make sure it's nice and dry. I'm going to start with the Sundance just to create a little bit of sun glow over the top of Luka's head. There we go. I like how that looks. So I'm going to move on to the Confetti, which is a pink, and we're going to go very light with it and make it a very light pink. And I'm just going to go around the mushrooms and avoid the river root here. And we are going to be painting the mushrooms, so I don't have to worry too much about getting some ink on top of them to really get in there and have a nice pink glow behind them. All right, I went a little heavy there, so I'm just going to blend out the edges for consistency. I would be the first to admit that blending is not really my superpower, but I try to make it work. All right, I'm happy with that. Looks like I missed a little spot right there, so let me get back in there. There we go. All right, finally we're going to use the olive to come in and color in that river root. And there we are. I think we're done with the ink blending here. So I'm going to move on to painting the mushrooms. And for that, I am going to be using my water brush because the poppy is a very dark color and I'm looking for a little bit more of a pale pink in there. So I'm going to start by adding lots of that poppy to my ink block. You might do it on your blending mat I'm going to add a little bit of water to it. All right, so I'm just going to mix that up a little bit and paint in my toadstools. Right. I think I'd like to add a little bit more depth to the edges. So I'm going to come back in with a little more of that and darken it up a little bit. All right, there we are. Clean that up and set it aside. Give it a few minutes to dry before I add my Posca pen. I'm going to come back in and finish this up with my white Posca pen and my white chalk pastels. So I'm going to start by adding some little white speckles to my toadstools and give it a little highlight just along the stems. These really are fun mushrooms to paint in and color. I think I'm gonna like using these a lot. And finally, I will give Luka a little bit of highlight along the top of his head, his ears, and a little bit on his tummy. And the last step for this little part of my project is to come in with a little bit more stickles, and I'm going to add some sparkles to the river root and the top of the mushrooms. And there we are. Can you see all that sparkle? All right, I'm going to set this aside to dry, and I'll be back and we'll work on those frames, which should be dry by now. So I'm just going to come back in with the stickles and add it to a couple of the corners. And I really like the look of it just kind of around those corners. So I'm going to use an old paintbrush and just spread it around up here in this corner and a little bit more in this corner down here. Add that there. I'm going to set it aside and give it some time to dry. And then we'll do the same with the grape. I think I'm going to do the opposite corners. I'm just using this old paintbrush once again to move it around and thin it out a bit. All right, and I'm going to set this aside and give it a little time to dry, and I'll be back to assemble it. I'm back and my images have had a long chance to dry. So I have the two tiny images that we stamped together earlier, as well as the frames that we painted and added our stickles to. Now it's time to pop them into the frame and glue them down. That one. And here they both are, along with the inspiration piece. Please let me know in the comments if you decide to give these projects a try on your own, or what other types of things you like to alter and make your own. And if you haven't already joined our Facebook groups, please consider doing so. You can share your own creations at Bello's Designs Lounge on Facebook, and also Bello's a la carte. Thanks for watching today. See you soon.